In 1931, the British government sent an official investigator to a farmhouse on the Isle of Man to take notes on a talking animal. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. Not a legend, not a myth being retold 300 years later. A living, breathing investigation, filed, documented, and then quietly shelved by people who had no idea what to do with what they found. The mainstream history books give you the summary. An eccentric family, possible hoax, case closed. But here is the specific thing they leave out, and this is the part that changes everything. The investigators who visited that farmhouse didn't just hear strange sounds. Several of them, adults, professionals, complete strangers to the family, reported hearing a voice that knew their names before they had introduced themselves. And so here is the question that mainstream history has never cleanly answered. If it was a hoax, how did it know? Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel exists because history textbooks were written to avoid the questions that make tenure committees uncomfortable. What we do here is different. We take the documented record, the court transcripts, the investigator reports, the letters, the newspaper archives, and we ask the questions the summary never asks. Today's case sits at the crossroads of documented historical fact, century-old folklore, and a branch of esoteric philosophy that some of the world's most serious scholars have never been able to fully dismiss. By the end of this video, you're going to know about GIF, the entity on the Isle of Man that spoke in multiple languages, recited newspaper headlines from days before the papers arrived, and may, according to one of the most fascinating and unsettling theories in paranormal scholarship, have never been an animal at all. Stay with me, because the mainstream explanation is somehow the least believable part of this story. Let's start with the facts, and I want to be clear, Lhasa. These are documented facts, court-level documented, newspaper of record documented. This is not campfire storytelling. In 1931, a farming family called the Irvings, James, Margaret, and their 13-year-old daughter, Voirrey, reported that an animal had taken up residence inside the walls of their farmhouse at Cashin's Gap on the Isle of Man. James Irving kept a meticulous journal. He was not, by any account, a credulous man. He described the sounds as beginning with animal noises, barking, hissing, spitting, that he initially assumed were from a small mammal that had found its way inside. Then it started repeating things back to him. Irving, a man with a farmer's practical instinct, began testing it. He made animal sounds. The voice inside the wall made them back, accurately, and faster than a parrot could learn them. He recited nursery rhymes. The voice finished them. He read from a book. The voice corrected a word he'd mispronounced. Within months, the entity which eventually named itself Gef, pronounced Jeff, and described itself as a little extra clever mongoose, had developed a personality. It had opinions, it had moods, it gossiped. Gef reportedly told the Irvings details about their neighbors, conversations overheard through windows, arguments that happened behind closed doors. It claimed to travel across the island and reported back. It asked for food, specifically biscuits, bacon, and bananas. And the family left them in a saucer that was found empty each morning. James Irving wrote all of this down, every word. The journals survive. Now here is where the official record gets genuinely strange. In 1935, the case attracted the attention of Harry Price, one of Britain's most prominent paranormal investigators, a man who had built his reputation on debunking supposedly supernatural events. Price sent a colleague, Captain MacDonald, to investigate. MacDonald was skeptical in the way that professional investigators are paid to be skeptical. He returned from the Isle of Man unwilling to explain what he had experienced. Price then sent a second investigator, a journalist named Lambert. Lambert went with the specific intention of exposing the hoax. His report, filed afterward, is notable for one thing above all others. It does not claim to have found the hoax. Lambert concluded that the sounds were real. He could not explain their source, and he could not explain how the family, particularly young Voirrey, could have produced them without detection. He could not explain the content of what the voice said. He filed a report that amounts, professionally, to "Something is happening here and I don't know what it is." Now, the mainstream summary says, "It was almost certainly Voirrey Irving throwing her voice. Case closed." But here are 3 specific things that summary doesn't explain. 1. Multiple investigators confirmed they heard the voice when Voirrey was verifiably in a different part of the house with her mouth visible. 2. The voice was reportedly heard by visitors who arrived unannounced, with no time for a setup. 3. And this is the one that keeps serious researchers up at night. Voirrey Irving, in an interview given decades later as an elderly woman, maintained to her death that she had not faked it. She said it had made her life difficult. She said she wished it had never happened. People who run successful hoaxes for 60 years don't typically die insisting the hoax was real. What do you think? Hey, drop it in the comments. Was Voirrey protecting a secret or protecting herself from something she couldn't explain? Here is where we need to stop treating this as a story about one eccentric family on a foggy island and start treating it as a story about a place. Because the Isle of Man is not just a geographic location. It is one of the most folklore-dense pieces of land in the British Isles, and it has been that way for over 1,000 years. The island's indigenous mythology is Manx, a Celtic tradition with roots going back to the pre-Christian Iron Age. And in Manx folklore, the idea of an entity that lives between spaces, between walls, between worlds, between the visible and invisible is not unusual. It has a name, the Buggin. The Buggin in Manx tradition is a shape-shifting spirit associated with liminal spaces, thresholds, ruins, gaps in stone, the borders between human habitation and wild land. It can mimic voices, it can appear as an animal. It has been described in Manx records going back to at least the 17th century as an entity that tests the families it encounters, sometimes malicious, sometimes playful, almost always unknowable. The Irvings farmhouse at Cashin's Gap sat directly on the edge of farmable land and open moorland, a liminal space by geography. Now, I'm not telling you the Buggin is the explanation. I'm telling you that when the Manx locals heard about Geff, several of them apparently didn't find it particularly shocking. The shocking part to the local community was that the mainland press was treating it as a novelty. But the Buggin is only the local layer, because Geff's behavior doesn't just map onto Manx folklore, it maps onto something much older, much wider, and much more philosophically unsettling. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is a concept called the tulpa, spelled Tulpa, originating from Tibetan sprolpa, meaning emanation or manifestation. The tulpa is a thought form, an entity created and sustained by concentrated mental energy. Not imagined, not hallucinated, but manifested, given independent existence through the collective will, belief, or need of the minds that create it. The first major Western account of the tulpa phenomenon was written by Alexandra David Neil, a Belgian-French explorer and Buddhist scholar who lived in Tibet for 14 years. Her 1929 book, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, describes her own experience of creating a tulpa, a visualized monk who gradually became visible, took on independent behaviors, and eventually became difficult to control. Her book was published in 1929. Geff appeared in 1931. David Neal's account has been scrutinized, challenged, and partially defended by scholars across 3 disciplines. What nobody has cleanly done is explain why her description of a thought form's behavior, the independent will, the personality, the gossip, the needs, the mood, maps so specifically onto the documented behavior of Geff. Let me give you the specific overlap. David Neal's tulpa, once manifested reportedly, moved, independently interacted with people other than its creator, had opinions and preferences that differed from its creators, became progressively harder to distinguish from a real entity. The Geff case record shows a voice that moved freely through the house, a voice that was heard and interacted with by visiting strangers, consistent personality, preferences, and then moods that the Irvings described as distinct from their own an entity that, over time, the family began to treat less like a presence they controlled and more like a presence they coexisted with. Now, I'm presenting this as theorists suggest. I'm not telling you this is what happened, but I am asking you, if the tulpa framework exists, if David and Neil documented it, if the behavioral signatures match, why has no mainstream historical treatment of the GF case ever mentioned it? That's not an accident. That's a choice. Let's talk about the conditions at Cashin's Gap because they are not incidental to the tulpa theory. They are, according to scholars of the phenomenon, practically a recipe for it. James Irving had moved his family to one of the most isolated farm properties on an already isolated island. There was no radio at first. Newspapers arrived days late. The nearest neighbors were not close. In 1931, the Irvings were living with a level of social isolation that is genuinely difficult to imagine in the modern world. Psychologists who have studied the GF case, and a number have, though rarely in peer-reviewed settings, point to what Carl Jung called the autonomous complex, a fragment of psychic content that becomes so charged with energy that it separates from the ego and begins to behave with apparent independence. Jung documented multiple cases of individuals who, under conditions of extreme emotional pressure or isolation, began to perceive entities that demonstrated knowledge and behaviors the person could not consciously account for. He called them split-off parts of the psyche that have acquired an autonomous character. But here is where the tulpa theory goes beyond psychology and enters a territory that mainstream scholarship finds genuinely inconvenient. The Tibetan understanding of the tulpa does not describe it as a hallucination. It describes it as an entity that begins as a mental construction and gradually acquires an existence independent of its creators. The distinction matters enormously. A hallucination is private. Only the person experiencing it perceives it. Jeff was perceived by multiple unconnected witnesses. Lambert heard it, MacDonald heard it, visiting neighbors heard it, journalists heard it. The hallucination model doesn't survive contact with the witness list, but the tulpa model, in its strictest Tibetan formulation, actually predicts this. Because a sufficiently manifested tulpa can be perceived by people other than its creators. It has, in Tibetan terms, achieved materialization. There is a third layer to this theory that I want to introduce carefully, because it comes not from Tibetan Buddhism or Jungian psychology, but from Manx tradition itself. Manx folklore contains a category of entity that the island's pre-Christian Celtic tradition called Farcidi, the people of the mound, a non-human intelligence associated with specific places rather than specific people. These entities, in the oldest Manx and Irish sources, did not originate from human minds. They pre-existed human habitation. They were encountered at liminal geographic points, the edges of fields, the borders between human land and wilderness, the gaps in old stone walls. Some folklore researchers, including Catherine Briggs in her landmark 1976 work, A Dictionary of Fairies, noted that the behavioral profile of these entities, the gossip, and the linguistic sophistication, the knowledge of human affairs, the unpredictable mood, is strikingly consistent across Celtic cultures that had no documented contact with each other. Briggs never referenced Geff directly. She didn't need to. The description fits like a key fits a lock it was cut for. So theorists are now presenting not one, but three overlapping frameworks. And all three of them arrive at the same structural question. What if Geff wasn't something that needed to be created? What if Geff was something that was already there? Something old, something place-bound, that the Irvings' isolation and need gave a way in. The tulpa model says, you made it. The Jungian model says, your unconscious made it. The Manx Farcida model says, it was already there, and you gave it a language. Three different traditions, three different centuries. One consistent behavioral profile. What do you do with that? I want to ask you 4 questions that mainstream history has never cleanly answered about this case. And I want each of them to come with a specific piece of the documented record that makes the standard explanation inadequate. Forbidden question 1. Why did the government investigators' report disappear from the public record for decades? Harry Price's complete GF files were donated to the Harry Price Library at the University of London. Some materials from his investigation remain catalogued, but the primary investigative correspondence, specifically the letters between Price and his investigators during the Cashin's Gap inquiry, have gaps, not lost. Gaps, catalogued gaps, filed spaces where material was removed. Nobody has explained what was in those spaces or who removed it. Forbidden question 2. How did Geff know things it had no access to? In Irving's journals, cross-referenced with local newspaper archives, there are at least 4 documented instances where Geff reported events or information that James Irving later verified were accurate but that the family had no access to at the time of reporting. In one case, Geff accurately described a fire at a property several miles away. The fire was confirmed. The family had not left the farm that day. No one had visited. Mainstream dismissal. Irving fabricated or embellished the journal entries. But Irving's journals were kept in real time. They were read by investigators contemporaneously. Embellishment in a private journal before an investigation begins, in sufficient detail to match later verified public records, is a very specific kind of forgery that requires knowing the future. Forbidden question 3. Why did Voirrey Irving, in her only major interview given to journalist Walter McGraw in 1970, describe Geff as something she was afraid of, not something she controlled? Hoaxers are not afraid of their hoaxes. They may feel guilt, they may feel pride, they may feel exhaustion. Fear is not consistent with authorship. Voirrey told McGraw that Geff had, in her words, made her life miserable. She said that she had never been able to make friends her own age because of the story. She said she had moved repeatedly to escape it. And then she said something that no journalist at the time knew what to do with. She said she had never been entirely sure that she was the only one who could hear it clearly. Forbidden question 4. What happened to the body? In 1947, 16 years after Geff's first appearance, a man named Leslie Graham purchased the Cashin's Gap farmhouse from the Irvings, who had moved away. Graham later reported that he had found and killed an unusually large mongoose on the property. He provided a photograph. Harry Price, still following the case, examined the photograph and concluded it was not consistent with the descriptions of Geff given by the Irvings. The animal in the photograph was too large. Its coloring was wrong. Price stated publicly that he did not believe Graham had killed Geff, which leaves 2 options. Either Geff was not a physical animal and therefore could not have a body, or Geff was a physical animal, it was not killed in 1947, and nobody knows what happened to it. Both options are extraordinary, and neither is comfortable. Here is the synthesis that some of the most serious researchers in anomalous phenomena have arrived at, not as a conclusion, but as the most internally consistent framework for what happened at Cashin's Gap. The Irvings arrived at a location that was, in Manx pre-Christian tradition, already significant. A liminal boundary point, a place where, in the local cultural memory, things that don't quite belong to the visible world have a history of making themselves known. Their extreme isolation created the psychological conditions that the Tibetan tradition identifies as hospitable to manifestation. Concentrated attention, emotional intensity, a small group with shared focus, and a profound need for something beyond the walls they were enclosed within. And the question of whether Geff was created by the family or encountered by the family, whether the Tulpa model or the CRYPTID model is the better frame, may itself be a false choice. Because what both traditions agree on is this: the boundary between what a mind can contain and what exists independently of a mind is not as fixed as the modern world has decided it is. The Tibetan teachers who trained David Neil did not debate whether tulpas were real. They debated how to manage them safely, because the question of reality was to them far less interesting than the question of consequence. The Manx traditions surrounding the CRYPTID don't debate whether these entities exist. They debate the protocols for coexistence. What you say, what you don't say, what you offer, what you refuse. Both traditions assume the thing is real. Both traditions treat the human relationship to it as the variable. The mainstream historical record, eccentric family, possible hoax, case closed, is the only framework in this conversation that requires you to dismiss the witnesses, distrust the investigator reports, and override Voirrey Irving's own dying testimony. You get to decide which explanation asks you to ignore more. The Geff case was never officially resolved. No final verdict was issued. The investigation files have gaps that haven't been explained. The only member of the Irving family who lived long enough to be interviewed denied the hoax to her death. The farmhouse at Cashin's Gap still stands on the Isle of Man. Nobody has lived in it since the Irvings left. Here is what I want you to sit with. 3 independent traditions, Tibetan, Jungian, and Manx Celtic, each developed their frameworks for exactly this kind of case. None of them required the other to be wrong. All of them agree on one thing. There are conditions under which the membrane between a human mind and whatever lies outside it becomes permeable. The mainstream record insists that membrane is always solid, that it has never, under any documented conditions, in any credible case, allowed anything through. The Irvings' journals, the investigators' reports, Voirrey Irving's final interview, and the unfilled gaps in the Price archive suggest otherwise. And you know what the most unsettling part of this story is? You are now one of the people who knows about it. Which means the question isn't just, what was Geff? The question is, what do you do with a mystery this well documented that the textbooks decided to quietly leave out? Drop your answer below. Tell me which framework resonates. Tell me what I missed. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. But tell me specifically why. Because this channel doesn't deal in closed questions. We deal in the ones that are still open. And next week, you and I are going to look at a stone structure that mainstream archaeology has quietly stopped discussing because the date on it doesn't fit the story they've already agreed to tell. Don't miss it.